Let's discuss Network Access Control, or NAC, also referred to as a Network Access Protection, or NAP. If we're talking about NAC, NAC, or NAP, NAP, we're talking about the same thing. NAP helps protect the integrity of the internal computer network by ensuring that any computer that tries to connect meets certain health policy requirements. You can use NAP to enforce the health policy requirements that you want all the computers in your organization to meet. For example, before you allow a computer to connect to the internal network, you can specify that it has a minimum version of Windows installed. It has an antivirus software installed. Its antivirus software definitions are updated. The Windows firewall is turned on, Windows Update is enabled, and the latest Windows updates are downloaded and installed. If a client doesn't meet the health requirements you specify, then you can place it on a restricted network where it can't access the sensitive information on the internal network. On the restricted network, you can then implement remediation servers that bring those devices back into compliance by installing, say, the latest antivirus software and definitions, maybe enabling Windows, firewall, and so on. NAP can also provide ongoing compliance for systems that were previously in compliance but haven't been kept up to date. Using NAP, you can move these clients from the internal network back onto the restricted network, where they can be remediated and brought back into compliance. There are several steps that occur when a client requests access to a NAP-protected internal network. First, the client must present a statement of health to a NAP enforcement point. The NAP enforcement point will then relay the information to the backend NAP server. The backend server will evaluate the statement of health provided by the client against your organization's health policy. If that client is compliant, then the client is allowed on the network. However, if the client is not in compliance, then it's connected to the restricted network where it's remediated. After the remediation is complete, it's allowed onto the internal network. You can implement NAP in several different ways using a variety of enforcement methods. The easiest implementation to configure is called DHCP enforcement. With this option, when a client requests an IP address from the DHCP server on your network, the DHCP server works with NAP to make sure that the client is up to date and healthy. Unfortunately, this implementation is also the easiest one to circumvent because it's dependent upon a DHCP server. If a client uses a static IP address and the DHCP server isn't used, NAP is circumvented. Another common NAP implementation option uses an IPsec protocol with the Health Registration Authority, or an HRA. This implementation is much more secure than the DHCP method, but it's a little more complicated to set up. It's the one we're going to focus on. In this implementation, the IPsec protocol is used to create domain and server isolation using several logical networks. Let's review how this works. Initially, the client that's trying to connect to the network isn't trusted, so it resides on an untrusted network called the boundary network. At this point, the client system hasn't yet provided a statement of health or validation. Basically, out here on the boundary network, there are three different types of computers. First of all, we have non-compliant NAP clients that don't meet our organization's health policy. We also have client systems that can't use NAP at all for some reason. For example, it may be using an outdated operating system, or maybe its operating system isn't supported by NAP. It also contains client systems that haven't provided a statement of health. In addition, this implementation also uses a restricted network. Any client that resides on the boundary network is untrusted, so boundary network clients are only allowed to communicate with other computers that are either also on the boundary network or that reside one layer deeper on the restricted network. They aren't allowed to communicate with the actual internal network. This configuration requires that NAP enforcement points are implemented somewhere where these untrusted clients out here can communicate with them. Therefore, the restricted network is a good place to put the NAP enforcement server. You can also implement remediation servers in the restricted network. Because the remediation server resides in the restricted network, the non-compliant systems out here in the boundary network can still communicate with it and bring it into compliance. For example, the remediation server may install the latest antivirus definitions on the client. In this NAP implementation, a computer on the boundary network doesn't have a security certificate yet. This is a problem. Because it doesn't have a certificate, it can't use IPsec to communicate. So it will use unencrypted communications with the NAP enforcement point and the remediation server. To get a certificate so it can start using IPsec, it has to make it all the way through the NAP system. The client system must present its client statement of health to the NAP enforcement point, which then communicates with the NPS server on the internal network. Then if everything checks out, the client is finally given a certificate so that it can use IPsec to communicate. After that, a client on the Boundary network can start using IPsec to communicate directly with hosts on that secure internal network. When this happens, the client is no longer on the Boundary network, it's on the secure network. A chain of communications takes place during this process. First, the client system communicates with the NAP enforcement point because it can't communicate with hosts on the secure network. The NAP enforcement point then communicates with the NAP server on the secure network using IPsec. If the client is out of compliance, it goes to the restricted network for remediation using the remediation server. If it is compliant, then the client will get a certificate so that they can communicate directly on the secure network using IPsec. Remember, the only client systems allowed on the secure network are the NAP compliant clients. That's it for this lesson. In this lesson, we talked about implementing NAP. We talked about the basic concept of NAP and how it works. We talked about the types of things you can require in health policy using NAP, such as making sure that the antivirus definitions are up to date. We talked about a couple of different enforcement methods for NAP. Finally, we talked about the 3 different networks you can create with IPsec and NAP: boundary, restricted, and secure networks.